everyone, and welcome to the sixth in a series of conversations from Mechanical Engineering Magazine on the impact of technology and engineering in a hopefully post-pandemic, post-COVID time. My name is John Kozowatz, and I am a senior editor for Mechanical Engineering Magazine and ASME.org. This latest and final session will focus on rebooting or rebuilding the supply chain for medical devices. It's being supported by COMSOL Multiphysics and Eccentric Mold Engineering. When the COVID pandemic began to hit its stride back at the beginning of the year, hospitals, intensive care units, and urgent care centers were inundated with large numbers of sick and very sick people. Soon, it was obvious there were critical shortages of everything from personal protection equipment, things like masks, gowns, and other basic needs, to sophisticated medical equipment and drugs, pharmaceuticals. Even not so sophisticated things like glass containers and tubes for testing devices. Engineers and even makers stepped forward to spot produce replacement parts through 3D printing and design and produce simple versions of ventilators, for instance. But going forward, both government and medical professionals will demand changes from their suppliers going forward. So what happened and how can it be corrected? To discuss this, let me introduce our panel today. Their experience is diverse, from supply chain management to pharmaceutical processing to interacting with companies in needs of solutions. Frank Gupton is professor and chair of the Department of Chemical and Life Science Engineering at Virginia Commonwealth University. His research focuses on improving global healthcare by making pharmaceutical production cleaner and more cost-effective. To help advance these goals, he founded the Medicines for All Institute with a simple idea: expand global access to life-saving medications by producing them more efficiently. Terry Haber is managing director of the St. Onge Company, a supply chain consulting and engineering firm. He's been in the global supply chain and logistics industry for over 25 years, working with over 300 organizations in more than 20 countries. He heads the company's supply chain assessment and third-party logistics outsourcing practices. Adam Callahan is Eccentric's Northeast Sales Manager. Eccentric supports injection molding in the medical equipment industry with rapid manufacturing services to help get products to market quickly and efficiently. He's a sales leader and former business owner, skilled at developing and leading successful teams. The medical equipment components Eccentric produces are of the critical path for pre-production testing, validation and verification, and limited market release production. He works with design and procurement teams to assure delivery of quality components. So gentlemen, welcome again.
Thank you.
And let's start at the beginning. Supply chains are global. In some cases, a device may be produced in one country, but key parts and components often come from somewhere else. And lean manufacturing works on a need-it-now basis, so stockpiles are low or even non-existent. Outsourcing has reduced costs, and OEMs prefer to deal with large contract manufacturing firms. Terry, can you give us a description of how the medical device chain works and the flaws that were exposed?
I think that medical devices, like a lot of advanced technology products, truly are produced in a global context. To your point, the machines, the componentry may be made up of materials that are coming from different parts of the world. And ultimately, when those machines are installed in medical environments, hospitals, healthcare locations, a great deal of what comes beyond the machine are parts and chemicals that are used to treat actual patient care in the facility. And so when you think about the shortages of supply in terms of transportation, when you think about risks that happen in a global supply chain, ultimately what people face are shortages of those materials when a global supply chain and logistics environment breaks down.
Can you give us a couple specifics about how you experienced this?
Sure. You know, you mentioned the point of outsourcing, and in today's environment, a lot of contract manufacturing, a lot of transportation and logistics have been outsourced to different partners. So there has been some loss of control from that perspective, where the upstream impacts of getting supply in and being able to have materials on hand in a region when shortages are available has really been exposed, particularly for those companies that have accounts and customers that are relying on an international chain. What we have seen and what we think will continue to happen will be a re-regionalization of some of that activity, to where it may be that there is closer access either to manufacturing being set up closer in region, or in some cases, an all-inclusive support function to be less dependent on the length of time and the shortages that are experienced.
Okay. So Dr. Gupton, pharmaceutical production is a bit different from medical devices, but it also is spread over a number of countries. Through Medicines for All, I know you're attempting to bring some of this manufacturing back to the US, and I'd like to talk about that in a bit. But tell us, what is the root of the problem here?
So I guess there's several issues associated with the fact that there's been a migration of pharmaceutical manufacturing outside of the US. One is the fact that when you start looking at the platforms that are being used to produce these drugs, they're characteristic of having a lot of flexibility, and they're using batch manufacturing techniques to be able to produce the active ingredients as well as the formulated products. And as a result of that, these are fairly labor-intensive procedures, as opposed to a assembly line or a continuous type manufacturing operation. So over the last several years, that manufacturing element has migrated to countries that have lower labor costs, so that they can produce them using batch manufacturing at a lower overall cost using the same platforms. Now, what we're looking at doing is applying some basic principles of continuous manufacturing to be able to make these things much more cost competitive and reduce the labor costs.
Okay. Okay. About what percentage would you say are the basic materials that go into making a pharmaceutical? What's the percentage that would be sourced outside of the United States?
Well, it's an interesting point, because most people look at it from the perspective of, making the active ingredient and making the formulated product, but the supply chain is much more holistic than that. It's about the actual building blocks that go into making the active ingredients, and those are all primarily outsourced to other countries too, particularly China and India. So when you start looking at it, that number is well over 80% when you look at it from the holistic supply chain.
Pretty large, pretty large. Adam, you're on the front lines with customers looking for solutions in a time of distress. Can you give us an example of what they were facing or what they are facing now during this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, what I'm seeing, especially across the medical industry, just as Dr. Gupton was talking about, a majority of the items that are being produced and so forth are offshored and in silos, right? So it's between, India and Asia. What we're coming to find, at least what they were finding, is that is far too siloed. Because if something happens, and it's not like this happens every day, but what this brought to light was having it siloed across one country or two countries and so forth leaves you to the exposure of something happening on this type of pandemic scale that caused you not to be able to bring in anything, literally anything, to start stuff. In our examples from the manufacturing side, one of the biggest issues that we've gone through is raw material. being able to pull in raw material from outside sources just to be able to do the work. It's not so much that the work wasn't there or that we weren't able to do it. It was just being able to pull the actual raw material, just a block of X, whether it be aluminum or steel or something. Being able to pull that in was a huge disruption. Our clients were finding that a lot of states were closed down. So the only jobs that were going through were essential jobs. That's it. So any non-essential job could not be manufactured if the state was in a shutdown environment at all. And so all of these have come through to see that folks are not able to, first and foremost, they're not seeing the resiliency in their supply chain. It all seems to be out of one or two places, and if those happen to drop, there's nothing that can be done. Sourcing of any of the raw material, bringing it in, was a huge problem. And then the aspect of non-essential or essential jobs. If you were non-essential, you were dead in the water.
Is that changing now?
As things are starting to open up, for instance, Eccentric was essential only for, I think, 6 or 7 weeks while the state of Michigan was in a shutdown environment. As that opened up weeks ago at this point, beginning of the month, we saw a very large influx of folks that were non-essential that said, hey, for the past 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, we haven't been able to produce anything anywhere. And being that we are a quick turn vendor, we're able to get things out very, very quickly. And so you've just seen this rush of business that's overloading folks.
Interesting. Okay. Let's go back to Frank for a minute, because one of his goals through Medicines for All is to bring back some of the manufacturing and the supply chain to the U.S. The Institute recently received a large grant from the federal government to do just that, creating a supply chain consortium with private industries. So, can you tell us how this will work? It's apparent that much of the supply for the U.S. comes from China, although no one, even the FDA, seems to be able to quantify the number. So what improvements have you made to the manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and how will that be, how will that come through with the consortium?
So, John, let me kind of use the model that we've developed over the last several years working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for reducing the cost of HIV drugs. And I work in that space and then apply it to this new opportunity. So the first thing that we look at is trying to improve the chemistry of the processes. So I'll give you an example. We had an HIV drug that had an overall yield in that process of a multi-step process of about 56%. And that was relatively a good process given the fact that it was like 4 or 5 step process. We were able to increase the yield to 92%. And that represent a really significant shift and reduction in the cost of goods for that process. But secondly, one of the reasons why there's been a migration over the years of movement of pharmaceutical manufacturing outside of the U.S. is that pharma processes generate a huge amount of waste. Typically, one pharma process to produce 1 kilo of the active ingredient, typically they'll generate 100 to 200 kilos of waste associated with it. And so this is something that we looked at as an opportunity. We took the same process and that wasn't generating as much waste as a lot of the other processes. It was generating about 60 kilos of waste per kilogram of product. We cut it to 4. So in doing both of those things, we dramatically improved the cost of goods and manufacturing cost situation. The third thing that we're looking at doing, as I mentioned earlier, is reducing the labor cost so that we can get to a more level playing field between us and other manufacturers. And the best way to do that is with automation. And if you reduce the amount of labor in those processes, then you can start to create a more level playing field. So we've been looking at developing continuous manufacturing methods to produce these compounds in automated systems. And so the combination of improving the chemistry, reducing the waste, and looking at automated platforms are the 3 approaches that we're taking to try and drive down the cost and reduce that gap between external manufacturers and U.S. manufacturers.
Can you give me an example of continuous manufacturing for one particular product chain?
Okay, this is really important, John, because I think the interesting thing about this is not new technology. This is just new to pharmaceutical applications. A lot of chemicals have been produced for years using continuous manufacturing. And the reason why is because the margins are so low. By producing these in commodity applications, you see two major areas of reduction by switching over to continuous manufacturing. One is the CapEx cost. The footprint's a lot smaller and the throughput's higher. And then secondly, you have a lower operating cost because you typically run in an automated system. A lot of these big commodity chemicals operations are only run by a few operators who are working in a control room. And we envision something like that with the pharma products. It's a trade-off though, John, because what you're sacrificing by going that route is you reduce flexibility, because the batch processes you can campaign in and out, whereas the continuous processes are running more dedicated equipment. And in the past, pharma companies have put a high premium on the flexibility of the processes as opposed to the operating costs. So from that perspective, I think that moving in this direction, one of the other things I will mention is that the FDA is really bullish on this continuous pharmaceutical manufacturing option, more because of the product quality issues and reproducibility of the process than in batch manufacturing. A batch process runs about 2 sigma, which means you get a failure every 20 to 30 operations, whereas a continuous process runs about 5 sigma, which means you get less than 1 failure every 1,000 operations or more. So you can see where there's an opportunity to be able to improve the product quality as well as the cost structure of these drugs.
Is this being done anywhere in the United States?
So most of it, unfortunately, most of it's being done overseas too, John. There's a couple, 2 or 3 of the major pharma companies are using it in their platforms right now, but they're in overseas operations. Where we see the opportunity is in the generic manufacturing, because the margins are less in with generics. And I think the last number I saw was something around 80% of all the drugs consumed in the US are generics in nature. So if we can actually drive down the cost of the generics, it's going to have a bigger impact on the overall population of the US.
Okay, all right. Terry, is there anything in this example that can be replicated for the medical device chain?
I think, it's similar. Obviously, a lot of the manufacturing of just about anything in the United States has gradually gone offshore, primarily due to labor costs and other restrictions, like we were talking about. But when we think about the manufacturing that remains here in the region, obviously a lot of automotive type products are continued to be made here with an intentional design. Typically technology related products, medical devices, or any kind of hardware style devices have been offshored, although Mexico specifically has taken a strong presence for a lot of that type of technology. So at the end of the day, I think from a manufacturing perspective, if we're going to ramp some things back up closer to home, so to speak, and deal with the differential of labor against the landed cost of bringing the materials across the world, there's going to have to be a definitive design in the market for how to do that. A lot of the factories today in the United States are not set up necessarily to manufacture these types of products. And so as we start to continue to think about bringing some of that back, the talent and the available resources and the actual factory style environments would need to be considered to be able to do that successfully on a big scale.
Do you see it? Do you see any movement toward that right at the moment?
Not a lot. I think what we see more today would be where core manufacturing for a lot of materials are offsite. But what we'll start to see is some postponement type services where a final configuration or maybe even a final sub-assembly is done here in the region to offer a little more flexibility than what we've seen in the past.
Okay. Adam, what's been the effect on your customers? You mentioned it briefly a little earlier, but how are they moving forward on this now?
So moving forward, folks are really kind of behind. That's the general feel that we've gotten from most of our clients is that they're behind the gun because of COVID. Whether it was their sales aren't on point for the year, on some sort of consumer business, or whether they're supposed to be delivering a device for, some sort of medical piece or medical safety out there, and they're super behind because they weren't able to get anything done. As that's ended, or as things are starting to open up, you're seeing these orders get fulfilled quite a bit more. You're seeing folks like ourselves, Eccentric, that are able to turn things quickly and at a good cost. We're getting a lot of business to try and get people back up and running. One of the big pieces actually that Dr. Gupton had mentioned was the automation side of everything. When it comes to the manufacturing and so forth, he's absolutely 100% correct between flexibility or automation, right? It's like you have one window that you can fit in because that's what's able to be automated, or you have the flexibility that humans are able to be done, right? A human benching team is able to do something very different on a injection molding cavity than an automated process. So there's always the ups and downs there. You're starting to see also a lot of folks that are starting to come inshore for things, saying, hey, you know what, we need a couple of parts. We know that we did a prototype tool a couple of years ago with a company. Are we able to still get some material from that? What is it going to cost? What are the parts going to cost? And hey, you know what, maybe we can do more to try and backfill a little bit if something like this happens again. Now we have another source that's domestic that, the moment it's opened, we'll be able to pump out something and so forth. So we're seeing not only a shift of having an influx of work, but we're starting to see a shift of people's thoughts where they're going, okay, it's nice to have outside of the U.S., but what do we have also for internal resources? Because if we don't have that, something like this happens again, and we're going to find ourselves in an even bigger issue.
A change in basic thinking.
Yep.
Okay.
You have to change it. Otherwise, nothing's going to move forward. We're going to find ourselves stuck in the same position.
Yeah. Well, there's been some movement in Congress to deal with supply chain issues, although there were some calling attention to concentration of production in China and elsewhere well before this pandemic hit. There's legislation, bipartisan legislation, that was introduced recently called the Strengthening America's Supply Chain and National Security Act. And it would have the Department of Defense determine how dependent it is on concentrated foreign sourced medical supplies and if it's a threat to national security. Pharmaceutical companies would have to report to the Food and Drug Administration on how much active ingredients they get from suppliers in different countries. It seems a very basic thing, Frank.
It is. This whole idea about transparency becomes really important when you start to understand the magnitude of how much offshoring is taking place across the entire supply chain of the United States. I mean, it's funny because one of the things that we found out in this process was that if you do the packaging over here and everything else is produced offshore, you have the opportunity to claim that it's made in the U.S. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that is something that, to me was a little bit disturbing to find out. And I think that this idea about making sure that people understand where their healthcare is coming from is really important, because in the last several years, we've had some significant recalls from China, and a lot of these antihypertensive drugs have been recalled because of the manufacturer decided to change the process and didn't tell anybody, and it generated carcinogens in the product, and that was within the last year. They recalled several of those, but then it goes back to several years in the past where we had a heparin scare, and the heparin was contaminated and caused several deaths. So, one of the things that the FDA is really takes to heart is this idea about, mitigating risk to the consumer. And part of the problem is that you begin to start losing control of that the more you're doing this on an international basis than when you're doing it on a national basis. I can tell you that I can only speak for when I was in industry. I was head of process development for one of the major pharma companies. And when we had an FDA inspection in the US, it was pretty rigorous. It lasted several weeks, and they looked at us from top to bottom. I cannot imagine that the same level of scrutiny is taking place in these other manufacturing sites. So this is another opportunity to control the quality of the drugs.
Okay. Terry, is there wisdom in revamping the global supply chain and consolidating it in one place, like in the United States? The big risk is that if one country is impacted by a pandemic or a natural or other disaster, things will fall apart quickly. When China closed, it cascaded around the world. So what is the proper mix, or is there one?
I don't know that there's a proper mix. I think a lot of times when we're talking to clients about their supply chains, there's a balance of what we call total landed cost, which is basically, the cost of production and transportation and logistics to get that good into region, and balancing that against the risk to service, which in this case would be, for medical devices, hospitals and other locations that are really dependent on either the device or some reagents or service parts that would fulfill those service requirements. And so just to say, let's redesign a supply chain to consider an all-in market type of an approach is somewhat practical from the sense of final assembly. But if you think about the tiers of a supply chain, a lot of the materials, a lot of the components are still going to be made offshore. So it's kind of a follow the manufacturer type model where you have to set up production, not just for the finished good, but for some of those materials and those components in close proximity as well. So I think the key to figuring that out is not just to change the overall manufacturing model, but it's to figure out what pieces of it can minimize the risk of service, which is what really got exposed during the pandemic. So I think in the short term, probably what we'll see is some manufacturing coming back, but I would say there would likely be a bigger buildup of inventories where people will start to stockpile some additional product so that when things do happen, they're not as caught as they were with some of the leaner type of inventories that we've seen traditionally.
Okay. Is the system insecure? There are arguments out there that say that there's really nothing wrong with the supply chain as is. The big problem is that there's multi-government intrusions, tariffs, export limits,
Right.
That exacerbates the problem. What do you think?
I think there's some of that. I certainly think with the trade conversation that's been happening within the last 12 to 18 months has put additional scrutiny on a commodity level, a part level type of tariff consideration. We've seen certainly an uptick in the procurement departments of companies to really take a deeper understanding of that. We talked a few minutes ago about China. There have been secondary sources of supply in other Southeastern markets. Frank mentioned India as well. There's just a whole series of things that really have to be well understood, and you have to remain current on it as well. You cannot put a supply chain in place and expect it to be static, and that's the way it's going to be until something changes. Things are changing literally every month. And so, some of the macroeconomic and political factors that get into traditional business are something that companies, I believe, really are starting to have to put more emphasis on understanding.
Okay, and Adam, you mentioned that a little earlier about how your people are starting to rethink things.
Yep. Well, one of the, that was one of the points out there is even previous to COVID, we were having discussions with folks about the various tariffs, the new taxes, and, what the import and the export. There's a wide variety of things that go into, going offshoring. Timing is a big one. Costs, of course, are the big ones. But the things such as your tariffs and your taxes aren't things that generally people really think about until all of a sudden you're whacked with a bill. And what you thought you were getting for $1 all of a sudden increased to $1.50. And now it's really cut into your bottom line type of thing. So folks have been concerned with the outsourcing nature of their manufacturing businesses for a while now, 12 to 18 months since these discussions were being had. So what we're seeing, or at least what we had seen, was folks that were actually putting, a monetary value to the time frame that they're waiting. Right? Like that is one way that you can sit there and dispel the savings that can potentially be offshore is if the timing isn't there. It's going to take you a while to get your stuff. Maybe you need it a little faster, and that encouraged them to be inside the U.S. The other piece was the pricing wasn't so great if the tariffs were going up another 25%, 30%. Now the pricing was a little more on par, and now you have the pricing is closer, but then the lead time is really long coming internationally, and so now it's starting to look real good on the U.S. side. So that was all previous to the COVID pandemic. COVID hits, and now you're seeing even more of that overall thought process starting to change. Because once you put in the tariffs and the different taxes that can go through, the time frame that things are taking, and the fact that we've had this international worldwide disruption based out of manufacturing coming from most of manufacturing coming from 2 spots in the world, and those spots shut down and shut everything down from there. That was the biggest issue that we ran into. So the diversification was already a thought process that folks had. COVID hit, and then diversifying their supply chain across, and this isn't just straight into the U.S., but it's across different areas. Going out to, some of the big folks that are out there, Germany, for some machining. Machining is huge out there, and a lot of folks are going there now as opposed to just staying in China and as opposed to just staying in India and so forth. So it's really quite exciting to be in the manufacturing world at the moment because everything is changing, and we don't know how it's going to look or what the best way is going to be moving forward because it is untreaded and uncharted territory.
Okay. Frank, can you speak to the subject on tariffs?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that this is kind of a two-edged sword. And when I look at it, I'll use China as an example. You're not really competing against Chinese companies. You're competing against the Chinese government because they're subsidizing a lot of the manufacturing that's gone over there. So you really don't have a level playing field to begin with when you start trying to compete competitively with onshore manufacturing. And so one of the things I keep thinking about, John, is given that current scenario, if you exclude the tariff issue, we may never get to a level playing field between us and these other manufacturing operations that are subsidized. But our job, what I think people realize now, is if we can close that gap to where it is affordable for us to be able to make a decision that there's a premium to be paid for manufacturing over here with regards to the quality and the accessibility of the drugs, in the case of pharmaceuticals, that the general public is willing to pay that slight premium as long as it's not excessive. And that's why this idea of driving the cost down as best we can to become as competitive as possible, and then understand where we are versus the benchmark of international manufacturing becomes really important in this whole exercise. But the tariff part of it, I think, is kind of a short-term response to this imbalanced playing field. I think the long-term play is to try and figure out how we can do this stuff more competitive.
Okay, which actually sort of speaks to the question I was going to ask next about pricing, because one of the arguments has been that if something is made in the United States, it's going to cost the premium, like you just said, and a much higher premium that people might not want to spend. So in your specific example there at Medicines for All, how do you keep the prices low? I think you touched on it a little earlier, basically
Well, I think,
through the production, no?
Yeah, you're right, John. We did touch on it on several points. One is, the cost of goods, raw materials. We're vertically integrating all the way back to petrochemicals as building blocks to put these molecules together in order to ensure that they're being produced in the United States. The second thing we're looking at is the manufacturing platform and the labor costs associated with it. But there's another element to this that I hadn't touched on yet, and that's the level of complexity of our U.S. supply chain of healthcare. And that is, I had a colleague of mine in government send me a kind of a roadmap to or a flow chart of all of the different transactional activities that take place from the time a drug leaves the pharmaceutical company until it actually gets to the consumer. So if we can actually simplify that, that's something that we can look. I won't say it's non-value added, but if we can actually take that supply chain and simplify it dramatically, which is what we're trying to do with this collaboration with Flow Corporation, to where we're directly interacting with the hospitals and the government, who are major consumers of these products, to be able to add value and reduce cost in a way that we hadn't even perceived in the past.
Okay. Terry, can you expound on that a bit?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that anytime you have a lot of handoffs in a supply chain, you introduce cost. And I think in general with healthcare, there's been a trend and a combination of consolidated buy sell of materials versus direct source by the actual user. And so we're working with companies now that are starting to understand that model. And when you think about pricing and you think about, we call it margin stacking, there's a natural level of expectation that everybody in the supply chain has for I buy and I sell to you, and so on and so forth. So the more there can be a consolidated ability to purchase and to manage that commercial conversation with the manufacturer itself, I think you really have an opportunity to take cost out of the network, and that may introduce opportunities in a regional conversation if you can do that, because you're dealing with fewer trading partners that have to collaborate and orchestrate that for final customer delivery.
Okay. After we've all been through an experience like the pandemic and the failures that we've seen, there's always lessons learned. So Adam, let's start with you. What are the lessons learned from the past few months?
Well, I would say overall, as a nation and as companies out there in general, I think, everyone's kind of touched on a variety of things. Dr. Gupton with the automation, you're going to see that a lot of folks are going to try and put in more automation into their various functions. I can speak to the manufacturing side just to try and reduce costs to keep it more competitive, because we're starting to see folks that are trying at the very least to come back into the U.S. You're also going to start seeing, in my opinion, a lot more people stockpiling. That was one of the things that Frank was saying. People are going to end up, again, as we've seen on the personal side, right? Everyone's been out to the grocery stores or something of that nature, seeing how all the toilet paper is gone, all of that wonderful stuff, because people are stockpiling because of this pandemic. I think we're going to see the same style of stockpiling with businesses where they were experiencing such a shortage. So instead of having a lot more of what we've been moving toward, which is manufacturing on demand, you're going to see a lot more people that are like, okay, well, maybe this on demand isn't quite 100% what I want, because what happened last time when it was on demand and then I couldn't get it and the demand was really high. So I think we're going to start seeing a little bit of a shift there, where people are going to start stockpiling not only raw material, but parts that they can also, just so that they have something to go to if something happens to disrupt their supply chain.
Okay. Frank, let me run that by you. What's the biggest lesson that you've learned through all this?
Well, if I could kind of expound on what Adam said, we're actually looking at this. You look at this dilemma that we've been in for the last several months. It's really kind of an acute problem and a chronic problem. So the acute problem is that we've got a real gap in the supply chain right now that we need to get fixed. But long term, how do we address this problem in a meaningful way? And one of the things that we looked back at as a model for how to do this is the strategic oil reserve. Because you think about what we did with the strategic oil reserve, in that we held crude oil here so that if we ever had a shortage, we could actually make our own energy or produce our own energy and convert that crude oil into gasoline and other products. We're looking at doing the same thing with a strategic healthcare reserve, or strategic active pharmaceutical ingredient reserve. And the way that would work is that to do it in a cost-effective way that kind of makes sense is that if you look at the supply chain, the manufacturing supply chain for drugs, you have starting materials, you've got the active ingredients, and then you've got the finished dosage product. And sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense to start all the way back to the simple building blocks, because it can take a while to convert those building blocks into the product at the consumer level. But there's an advantage to storing at the active ingredient level, and the advantage is that it has a longer shelf life. Once you go to a finished dosage product, a lot of times the shelf life will drop off, so that if you don't consume that material, then you have to dispose of it, or particularly if it's a formulated product, you typically have to dispose of it. Whereas if it's the active ingredient, it has a much longer shelf life and can be quickly converted into the active ingredient to the formulated product. And in doing so, you're at a lower cost point in the supply chain. So you get two benefits from that. One is that it's more stable, and the second is that it's lower cost. So these are the things that we're looking at right now, is actually starting to build that strategic reserve of the active ingredients, so that the next time this happens, we can rapidly convert them into the finished dosage product and make them available to the general public. I might add too, John, though, that, and I think both Adam and Terry mentioned this problem existed long before COVID-19. I mean, there were over, I think, somewhere between 200 and 300 drugs in short supply in the US, because of the fact that we had very low inventories of these products. And anytime we got a spike in consumption, we ran into a short supply situation. So this is something that I hope will not only address this problem that COVID-19 has shined a light on, but also this whole supply chain issue and shortages that occurred long before COVID-19.
Okay. Terry, how about you? What's the biggest lesson learned?
So one of the things they teach you in Logistics 101 is that every good contingency plan needs a contingency plan.
Yeah.
And when we think about any kind of supply chain, but especially these that we're talking about today, there's almost three that are connected. You've got the raw material sourcing, you've got the finished goods manufacturing, and you've got the final mile delivery to the customer. And interestingly enough, prior to coronavirus, we had noticed with many companies where we go in and we do supply chain assessments, that whether it be at a plant level or whether it be at a global supply chain level, people do not have formal business continuity plans. They do not have those plans in place that are pre-thought and documented at the level they need to be. And I think what we'll start to see more of in the future is, as the supply chains start to evolve, because it's going to take decades for them really to get reformed, you'll start to see a lot more contingency planning in each of those three segments, so that people really have a way of thinking about it. And it'll change policy, it'll change structure, it'll change the cost strategy in the short term. But I really think being caught in an unexpected situation, whether it's a pandemic or whether you're just losing a key supplier and that was your only source of supply, it's those contingency plans that people will really start to develop a stronger process for.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we've about reached our time limit for today. And again, I'd like to thank Terry Haber, Frank Gupton, and Adam Callahan for sitting down and talking about rebuilding the medical device supply chain. Again, this is the sixth and final session in Mechanical Engineering Magazine's webinar series on the impact of technology and engineering post-COVID-19. If you've missed any of the previous sessions, you can view them without cost through the resources below. Thank you all for viewing.